in rather soulful, pensive mode, and yet we know that he was a famously extrovert performer on the violin. Felix Yaniewicz, or Felix Yaniewicz as he would originally have been, came from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. He was a violin virtuoso, also a composer, and he'd had an interesting career on the continent, initially playing for the Polish king in the Chapel Royal in Warsaw. Then the king paid for him to go to Vienna, where he met Mozart and Haydn. He subsequently went to Italy to learn with the great violin masters, and then wound up in Paris, where he gave his sensational debut concert at the Concert Spirituel. And it was the outbreak of the French Revolution which put a stop to Yaniewicz's French career. So, like a number of musicians, he jumped ship and came to Britain at that point. He made a career for himself starting in London, teamed up with some other émigré musicians in London, such as Clementi. He came via Liverpool, where he set up a musical instruments business. He was an impresario, organising as well as playing in concerts up and down the country, and eventually came to Scotland in 1815, where he was involved in founding the first Edinburgh Music Festival.
So there was a huge period of development in Scotland in the 18th century. As there was in Dublin, the city where I'm from, and suddenly everybody has a little bit more money, there's slightly more peaceful times, and people are building beautiful houses like the one we're in today, these Georgian mansions. It's a fascinating point in musical history because you're changing from before and after the revolution. I guess before the revolution people were relying on rich patrons like kings and queens to support musicians, and then suddenly after that musicians are looking to make a living for themselves. So the whole structure of concerts changed, and you have these entrepreneurs like Yaniewicz making his own opportunities, presenting concerts for Edinburgh audiences. So he has to appeal to a wider mass than was necessary beforehand.
This is a story of migration. So he came from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and he arrived in this country essentially as a refugee from the French Revolution. There's a contemporary source which describes how during the period of the partitions of Poland and its eventual annexation by Russia, his fortunes were involved in the general wreck. So we don't know how much he had other than his violins when he came to this country. So music was his passport.
Our concert with the Scottish Chamber Orchestra tries to recreate one of these concerts from the 1800s that Yaniewicz would have put on in his first Edinburgh Festival. So it's a big mix of different types of things. So some local Scottish melodies, arranged in this case by Bach's youngest son. And then some mainstream works like Haydn makes an appearance. And also then we have a showcase for Yaniewicz himself. Of course, it's very sophisticated music, the kind of thing you'd associate with Mozart. The melodies, the structure of the first couple of movements, there's so much there that just rings true and sounds like this is a Mozartian world. In fact, there was even a rumor that Mozart wrote a piece for Yaniewicz that's now lost, but one of the biographers covered that. So there's a connection there that's really fascinating. Especially for the Scottish Chamber Orchestra, we play so much Mozart over the years. We're so used to this language. We've travelled all over Europe and the world playing Mozart. So it's really nice coming back to Scottish Chamber Orchestra with this kind of music, but it has a Polish and a Scottish connection. His violin concertos are especially interesting, and they bring that mix of cultures. So you have the kind of Mozart style, beautiful lyrical classicism in the first and second movement, but his house style was basically to have a third movement that was like a folksy dance style. In the third concerto, I think that's maybe the best example, that you have these two beautiful classical style pieces that you would have heard at the Concert Spirituel in Paris. But yeah, the last movement is just pure, it's a polaka, so Polish style music, which often has a theme running throughout, and then the solo violin just a very fancy stuff up an octave. You can imagine just, you know, like kicking back after quite a sophisticated formal couple of movements into this wild Scottish evening, and there's this polacca that comes at the end of the piece.
It's a fascinating new piece in the history of Edinburgh particularly, and it was hailed very much as a turning point in Scottish musical culture.